Welcome to episode 153 of Silver Lining for Learning. This one's on pondering the future of OER, Open Educational Resources, and Open Education. I'm here with my co-host of Silver Lining for Learning, Chris Dede at Harvard, Yang Zhao at the University of Kansas and University of Melbourne as well. Missing in action and off in DC presenting at a conference is Punya Mishra from Arizona State University, who'll be setting this up in YouTube later on. We're blessed with a couple of guests from Europe today. We've never had anyone from Norway in this show before. We had Finland a couple of times, but Juliane Granly, and I'll introduce her in a second. My good friend Mark Brown from Ireland just got back from Lithuania 1 hour ago. He's probably still in the air in his brain. But let me introduce this session a little bit further before we talk to each one of them. Mark Brown is the chair of digital learning and director of the National Institute for Digital Learning at Dublin City College in Ireland. He's been involved in this gig, in this game, for more than 30 years, working in higher education. His resume is endless. His bio is just read his bio. It's in the blog post, but he's been involved in the New Zealand Academy of Tertiary Teaching Excellence. He's an Eden Fellow. He's part of the Commonwealth of Learning, European Distance and E-Learning Network, and on and on and on. And Mark recommended Juliane Granly today, who's a project and development manager for ICDE, the International Council for Open and Distance Education, the leading global membership organization for open, flexible, and distance learning. So we'll be talking to both of them in just a second, but let me frame this a bit. The reason I initially contacted Mark, and a couple other people I will say as well, and Mark's the only one that replied to me for some reason. I was watching an episode in YouTube from Open Education Week, Open Education 2023, what is the future of open education? That was back in March. It was a panel of policymakers and experts in online open and distance ed, reflecting on the current situation of open ed. Open education is a philosophy, a way of carrying out education with the aim to widen access and participation to everyone by removing barriers and making learning accessible, abundant, and customizable for all. Open ed has been exploding and becoming increasingly important, not only in European higher education, but on a global stage as well. And so in this panel, they were reflecting on the benefits of open education and how the pandemic maybe accelerated it or not, whether ChatGPT and developments in generative AI did, and other issues in the context of open education, and how we can do open education in a good way, bad way, how to help policymakers and so forth. So I'll stop reading that. You can go to YouTube and watch the panel. I will now ask Mark and Juliane to reintroduce themselves and tell us a little bit more about your involvement in OER and open education in general. And then I'll ask a couple of questions. I've got like 12 here. I've been scratched out late last night. I rewatched the panel, Mark, and I put all your comments in there. So I'll ask a couple, and then Chris and Young will jump in as well. So you want to take a couple of minutes to expand on what you've been up to in terms of open ed? Juliane, maybe you want to go first.
Happy to go first. My story with open ed, as Juliane, is certainly much shorter than Mark, as I have currently been in ICDE working as a project and development manager for about 2.5 years. So looking at the bio, as you referenced earlier for Mark, I know we can hear a lot of interesting things also from Mark. My position in ICDE is where my link to Mark comes in. So ICDE, as you mentioned, is a membership organization for open and flexible and distance education. We are a membership organization and we are extremely old. Started with education as distance education, back when distance education was remittance letters, where you letters in the mail back and forth with your teacher. That has certainly progressed, and now more often than not, we're talking about open education, not just distance or online or other means of flexible provision of education. We're talking about openness. It is also now a big part of what we do in ICDE. So about me then, that's my job in ICD. I work with projects, and the core project that I work with is called Encore Plus. It is the European Network for Catalyzing Open Resources in Education. And this is also where I work with Mark. Mark, DCU is one of the partners in that project, where over the last 2.5 years, we've established a network of stakeholders, an OER community in Europe, now about 500 individuals that are discussing, we're doing research, we're having events on what is happening on OER, what do we need to solve, etc.
When you say we are the oldest, no, the four of us are the oldest. You're the youngest. I'll guarantee that. Mark, you want to jump in here?
Yes, I'll try and be as brief as I can. Those who know me know that that's not a quality I often have. Well, in your introduction, you indicated I have a Southern Hemisphere, what we would describe as a down under connection. So I'm originally from New Zealand. I've been in Ireland for 10 years. One of the early initiatives that I was involved with, a very good colleague who's now at the UK Open University, Karina Bosnu, is developing an Australian open education protocol that was a nationally funded project. I was looking back for another project just recently, and I think it was 10 years ago that we published our last publication associated with that project. And I guess that's a nice sort of starting point, in that some of us are old enough, maybe wise enough or not, to sort of see how history repeats. So the OER movement, I've been heavily involved, or the OEP, I think in the way you framed the introduction, we would mostly agree that it's a multi-dimensional concept that we're talking about. But I've been involved in many of the tentacles associated with OEPs and OERs, the MOOC movement, the first sort of major MOOC in New Zealand. Here in Ireland, I've been involved working with the FutureLearn platform initially. A long background with open source, which is another tentacle to OERs. And my own institution is heavily committed to Moodle. We've just hosted the UK Ireland Moodle Moot. I was heavily involved, and my institution led the development of the Mahara ePortfolio open source platform, which we also use here in Ireland extensively. Open publishing is something that also is a really strong commitment that our team has here in what we call the NIDL, the National Institute. Actually, every year for the last 7 years, we've been publishing our top 10 open access journal articles in sort of the general area of EdTech, digital education. I was chair of the last ICDE World Conference, believe it or not, November 2019 here in Dublin. 850 delegates, 80 countries, and none of us predicted the great onlining of education in the next few months, as George Siemens coined the word term. So all in all, a lot of interest, a lot of activities that have an open dimension to them, and underpinning all of that is a kind of, I'm going to borrow the words here from a giant in a real, figure of our times. Nelson Mandela said once, you have to be the change you want to see in the world. So for me, in every way possible, I try to live openness. And that's not always easy, because openness is entangled with the closed world that we also engage with.
Thanks, Mark. I was thinking about your piece with Karina Basu on feasibility, and it was one of my 10 questions. We may get to that. Karina has a chapter in my MOOCs and Open Ed Around the World book, and you have 2 in that book, actually. And I'm happy to hear about the connections that you have with her. I will say that Young is supposed to be in New Zealand right now, but his flight was canceled, just so you missed that earlier. I'm going to go back to your opening comments in the panel that I watched early this morning, maybe 3 a.m., where you talked about Open Ed being a popular catchism, and it's subject to a lot of interpretations. And then I'll have Juliane jump in and talk about those interpretations. But after that, you talked about the number of problems that we have in having, closed cultures, not an open, closed practices, closed journals, closed reward systems, you want to explain what you mean by closed and what the possibilities for opening any of those up are and how we could, proceed, I guess.
Sure. Let me just pick up on the first comment around, I guess, what we are grappling with here. When I said that it's a popular catchism, I may have or may not, because I sometimes use this analogy, think that OER is a bit like fly spray. Yes, spray it all around. It sort of does its job, whether it kills off the right things. It doesn't always smell as good as it could. Some people are allergic to it, but actually ultimately you can't really feel it. So there's so many different dimensions, and its concept, or openness, is a concept that's used and misused. And I guess I'll give you my headline quote. I used it once in New Zealand and it made one of the Sunday newspapers. So I now feel like it's kind of in the public domain. I've borrowed it from who knows whoever. I'm sure you've heard it before, but OER is a bit like teenage sex. Everyone says they're doing it, but the truth is very few are, and those who are doing it quite poorly. So that's the, the headline, if you like. I got that one off my chest as quickly as I could. Coming to your question more specifically around I've called it entanglement just a few minutes back with the closed world. We fool ourselves if we think the world we live in is truly open, despite those of us with philosophies that are committed to openness. So the work is inherently political. It's not just pedagogical. It's not just about open practices. And the biggest challenges that I come across are closed mindsets and organizational cultures, in particular in higher education institutions, but you could extend that to even the corporate world, that for whatever reason are threatened by the idea of opening up.
Juliane, you want to jump in and add anything there?
Thank you, Mark, for making things very clear with great analogy. I think there's a lot to be said about the idea of whether or not we are truly becoming more open. We keep hitting the same barriers, although we are trying to find the ways to make education more open. We're back to some sort of fear in one instance. You mentioned culture, closed culture, but people don't still understand it very well, and it is a threat for a lot of institutions and a lot of businesses and etc. They perceive this as very threatening, complicated. Surely there's a number of things that we need to tackle in order to make education truly open. And maybe I'm just laughing at the analogy about OER, open education, is like teenage sex. Maybe we still have so much to do, in the sense that people are still talking about it. We are really moving forward in talking about it, but the real implementation is still lacking a little bit.
Thank you on that. Just in general, Juliane and Mark, is OER a movement? Is it a philosophy? Is it a practice? Is it all of that? And if it is, best thought of as a practice, have you seen any best practices? And what would you describe? Where do people look to those best practices?
I could maybe quickly just say, I think, first of all, it's all of the above. And that's partly what is tricky, perhaps. It also depends a little bit on how you attack it, or from what angle you look at OER or open education as a whole. Personally, for me, it might be more of a philosophy, where I have a background in development, where for me, it's so much about the access and inclusivity of education. But it is also a methodology, it's a tool, it's a resource in order to actually provide better education as well, beyond simply access. I'll give it to Mark quickly then.
Yeah, well, I would have to agree that it's all of what you said and more, to be honest, because one of the things that the Encore project has done is looked at, and we've published a report on this, in business models, and also the importance of linking the business or commercial sector with the public education sector. One of the sort of underpinning assumptions of that project is the need to build a more connected ecosystem, certainly in the European context. So when you're talking about OEPs, OERs, that's a stakeholder, an important voice that sometimes in the past, I think we've tended to demonize. Now, it's not as straightforward as I'm suggesting, because in my own work, I have a particular framework I sometimes link to, that openness can also play into the hands of the neoliberalists. Opening up, the ultimate for a neoliberal market is this open free market approach to things. And that's almost contrary to many of the principles and values that those who espouse openness might have. So that's kind of, again, an example of this entanglement. We also have to challenge a fundamental flaw in a lot of the thinking, is that OERs are not free. And we might make a distinction, a subtle distinction, around free to use, but there's nothing really that's free. Maybe you could argue the air we breathe is free, but I don't even think that's the case these days. So, you know, there are some myths underpinning OER, and another aspect to it is in the evolution, if you like. I'm reluctant to use the word evolution, the maturing, because it's not just a continuum we're talking about here. This is much more complex than that. The focus on content, and very naive focus on content, to think that content would somehow transform pedagogy. Actually, you know, the textbook movement emerged out of teacher proofing, the concern that teachers weren't delivering the curriculum in the way they should have. I'm being a bit generalized here, but if you look at some of the US history of textbooks in particular, so we had to teacher proof by developing textbooks. And you asked, can we give you some examples of successes? Arguably, the textbook being turned into an open resource is a great example, particularly out of Canada, out of the US. Probably not so many great examples of that in the Europe, but that also presupposes that the textbook itself is a good type of technology. No challenge to the status of the textbook. So for me, content is not king or queen. And actually, I embrace emptiness as part of openness, emptiness in content, not populating more content. I don't think we have a lack of content in the world.
Chris is going to jump in here. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Juliane. Chris?
So one of the hats that I wear is that I'm Associate Director for Research for an organization here in the US that's funded by the National Science Foundation. They actually have funded at this point 25 national AI institutes. And the one that I'm involved with is the National AI Institute for Adult Learning and Online Education. So it certainly intersects with what we're talking about. And a lot of its focus is workforce capacity building. So we know that as many needs as we have in pre-college education and as many needs as we have in higher education, the amount of reskilling and upskilling that the workforce needs kind of dwarfs those in terms of the amount of educational resources that need to be provided. And that reskilling and upskilling is driven by a lot of factors. It was driven by the pandemic, it's driven by climate change, driven by failure to reach the UN sustainability goals, by disruptive technologies like generative AI, but certainly not limited to generative AI, and so on and so on. And where this intersects, I think, with what we're talking about is in two ways. First, we have to find ways of delivering education that are massive. And of course, MOOCs turned out not to be the right path for that because of the pedagogy. But we had an episode a few months ago where leading universities, Harvard, Stanford, and MIT, talked about the lessons that they had learned from the pandemic and remote learning that they thought would now influence their online learning and even their classroom learning. And one of the things that I discussed was that maybe it's time for massive learning 2.0, that we learned some of what not to do in massive learning with MOOCs. Because of the pandemic, we now have a much better infrastructure for online learning, and many more people who, whether they appreciated it or not, had to learn how to do online learning. And so maybe it's time to think about version 2.0 and to build on the lessons from the past and to build on the excellent work that's going on in the present that the two of you represent. But the other thing that I think about beyond massive is I think about self-directed, because at the end of the day, the scale of what's needed is more than even an ecosystem of educational institutions can provide. In other words, we're not really in the education business anymore. The education business can't meet the demand. We're in the lifelong learning business. And that is a really different business. And I think OER and Open and the other things that we're talking about are a big part of how self-directed on lifelong learning can take place. So I don't know whether you see that as a kind of a reframing or an extension of what we've talked about so far, but I'd be very interested in hearing both of your thoughts on this.
Chris, you're throwing in a whole heap there, but Juliane, if you don't mind, I'll jump in and you can feed off me if you like from an encore perspective, but you just triggered so many different things for me. The first is there is quite an important difference across the Atlantic from Europe to the US or to North America in terms of what I'll call drivers and attractors. Because there are two thick parts playing here. One is pushing, the other is pulling us. Example, in Europe, there has been a very long tradition of lifelong learning. Actually, in Norway, in the Scandinavian countries, it's kind of just deep in the DNA. And I say that with confidence because I could bring up an OECD slide on figures of lifelong learning, and you will see the Scandinavian countries. Notably, you will also see New Zealand alongside those countries. In Europe, in other countries, we actually have a very low rate of lifelong learning. The average generally in all of Europe, and we produce these on an annual basis, is around 15% of adults over the age of, I think it's 22 to 65, something like that. It's a figure that they calculate in each country, each EU member country. That's incredibly low in the context of your discussion around upskilling, the changing nature of work, the impact now that, of course, AI is having. But where I would probably take a slightly different tack is I don't agree that MOOCs didn't deliver. And that what we are seeing in this part of the world in particular, but I think you've got evidence of this in the US as well, that micro-credentialing, the micro-credentialing movement, which alongside AI, not to be confused with another important dimension to our discussions, academic integrity alongside AI. The two AIs are actually quite important, but the micro-credentialing movement is huge. And in Europe, we have a European-wide approach to this. And micro-credentialing, the MOOC platforms have and continue to drive this. Actually, an OECD report published back in March shows double-digit growth still in the major MOOC platforms in their micro-credentialing. Now, we can debate whether these are truly open or not. We have a model that we've discussed in the Encore project around freemium, where there's an element of free and an element of paid. But to my mind, the MOOCs have evolved. They haven't failed. And I'll stop on that note and let Juliana come in.
Okay, yeah. So when you were talking, Chris, I was thinking about what you were saying about the way things happen through the pandemic, right? So let's say ICD, as a membership organization globally for open online and flexible learning, there was a scope of the types of members that we could work with. Within a couple of months, the entire world, right, was suddenly doing some version of online or remote distance education. I think it's important that we keep reminding ourselves that that was not true distance, true online education. That was emergency remote teaching, right? It has had such benefits to the way now people are open to the idea that education can work differently. But also we saw so many terrible, awful examples of how things can go really wrong when we don't do this right. But when it comes to OER and kind of where does OER fit in the kind of future of education, a little bit around what you were talking about AI and we're talking about lifelong learning. I think that the way I often see OER is more of an opportunity, right? So OERs or open education, it gives an opportunity for scale. Now, one thing is scale per number of students, right? It could be a scale of number of courses, but it could also be an opportunity to become more relevant. The pace at which content or materials or even courses, right, are updated to be relevant to the current nature of the world we live in and the workplace. I think that is the opportunity that we need to focus on, and that's why it also fits so well with lifelong learning. Lifelong learning means that it needs to be tailored to the kind of upskilling and reskilling that needs to happen, and that keeps changing, right? I think OER is here to stay. I think it's interesting that, Mark, that you bring up the idea of freemium. Brings us back to the clarification that you made earlier, how OER is often, the word free is thrown around very easily, whereas it's usually, that's not necessarily the case. It's free to use, not free. I think we're seeing a lot of interesting things that goes along with the OER and open education movement. I think we touched a bit about the publishing and such. With now we're seeing the open science movement getting quite a lot of traction, moving very fast, but also hitting a lot of barriers, getting a lot of pushback from corporate actors. Again, thinking about the freemium models and all the other business models that's related to open. It's interesting. I think at least we have not found the perfect solution for anything, right? For most of the world, open is still quite new. We have some actors that are excellent at it, that have done it for years and years and years. We have a ton of open universities. We have a ton of examples showing that using open as a means to provide education is inclusive. It is making sure that people can access it. And with that, I also just wanted to remind us that, going back to the emergency remote, one of the core things that we saw also in Europe is that people don't have access to digital, right? In Norway, still a problem. I think people were quite surprised, right? And open or OER does not mean online, although it most often is. We know that we can now have open textbooks that are physically printed. We can do all of that. So also to keep that in mind as we kind of progress with open, it doesn't have to be digital.
Well, I like the ways that both of you are thinking about this. And we had a recent episode on micro-credentials. They are a very important complement to degrees and certifications and the more traditional ways of measuring whether or not an educational system has worked in terms of giving someone knowledge and skills. And I think that that's only going to continue and become more sophisticated as AI enables performance assessments that are more accurate about what somebody knows than the proxies that we're using with different kinds of psychometric tests. And part of what the AI Institute that I'm working with is doing is looking at ways to develop performance assessments like that. The other thing that I think is, I would agree that MOOCs have done some good things and that they're continuing to mature. But I think that one thing that the emergency remote learning, with its many problems, highlighted is the importance of engagement. That we know more about learning engagement, about doing learning at scale than we know about doing engagement at scale. And the framework that says you need cognitive presence, social presence, and teacher presence to get engagement at scale is one that, again, the institute that I'm working with has found productive. And they're busy building AI tools with the intent of trying to increase cognitive presence, teacher presence, and social presence. Whether or not we're on the right track, I think those are dimensions that we really need to think about, both in terms of current MOOCs, and then if there is a new generation of massive learning environments, what those will need to be part of that as well. But John, I want to toss it to you for whatever your questions and thoughts are.
Yes, Mark, I'm supposed to be in New Plymouth right now, but I'm still in the US. The flight got canceled, so couldn't fly into Auckland. But anyway, so I got really two questions, because when I was thinking, first of all, I was thinking, the idea about learning has escaped schools. That is, learning is in essence, ubiquitous. If you want to learn something today, when Chris was talking about self-directed learning, you could really learn that. That's why I always talk about Americans, Thanksgiving dinners get higher quality because of YouTube, and now probably because of TikTok. So that's definitely, if you want to learn something, you could. Of course, when Juliane says that internet access could be a limitation, but of course, with Elon Musk, we got a new internet availability is possible. That's so what really struck me as interesting is that the open education movement, which Kurt talks a lot about, has not really touched the K-12 schools. I've been to really thousands of classrooms in K-12 schools in New Zealand, Australia, in Ireland, of course, many different countries. They have not really touched. If you talk to the teachers, the students, they are in essence, their classroom is the organization. They may bring in a video, they may bring in something, but the majority of students are not learning openly in that sense. So because we call it learning has escaped, but credentialing has not escaped. But that's my question there is really, I want to hear from Juliane and Mark, since you are very familiar with this, is that how OER or open education has generally not reached K-12 schools, in our context. But then before you answer that, I have a more specific question. When Mark, I was really surprised, Mark, you were talking about percentage of lifelong learning. You were talking about New Zealand, the Scandinavian countries doing better. Because in my mind, everybody is doing some kind of lifelong learning. You will be forced to do it, right? I mean, if you lose a job, what are you going to do? You go find a new job. You got to go learn something. You have to do that. So I was wondering how you were defining lifelong learning. And watching TV is not always learning, but it's some part of watching TV is learning, right? Sometimes you listen to a podcast. So how, in your report, how did you define lifelong learning, and how did you calculate that percentage of people? You know, in Scandinavian countries like Juliane, Norway, you know, just too much snow. You got to learn something, you know, just what can you do for 8 months, right? You got to do something. So anyway, just go ahead, Mark and Juliane, so how you define that, start first, and then going back to where OER is in relationship to K-12 schools. Thank you.
So shall we just start on a kind of methodological lesson for listeners? Because I think it's a good thing that we never take figures or statistics thrown at us at face value, because there's a really important question here between the validity and the reliability. These are often quite confusing concepts for new researchers. You could argue that these figures are reliable because they're published every year. I'm talking about, they come from the Eurostat. That's the source out of the European Commission's Eurostat office. So they're reliable in that the same methodology is adopted every year, and it's comparative for each country. But are they actually measuring lifelong learning? I won't bore you with the detail of how they go into doing that, but they try to take a sample of people in a given week, and they want to see what they've done during that week. I personally don't define lifelong learning, and it's a little bit cliche-like, but in most of the literature that I value, lifelong learning is generally linked to the UNESCO pillars of learning: learning to be, learning to know, learning to do, learning to live together. And it's important to add a fifth pillar that wasn't originally introduced when those were first published in the 50s, learning to change and transform, because we don't want to just reproduce. And in Europe, there's actually been, now it would be 10 years ago, where a publication, a unit was developed to monitor lifelong learning across European countries with an index based on those pillars and a comparative index. It's a shame that that wasn't kept, because it did triangulate some of what I've shared with you in relation to the Scandinavian countries. But that's my definition of lifelong learning, and a lesson around maybe the critique of the validity of the measure. But ultimately,
I'm sorry, Mark. So it's a sample,
yes.
And then they were surveyed and say what they were doing, and then whoever is sampling that is trying to define certain activities as lifelong learning. Or did you ask, for example, did you lifelong learn? Did you do this?
So, yeah, to make this really clear, it's not research that I've done. It's done for and by the European Commission, but essentially they do differentiate between formal education, non-formal education, and informal learning, or you would put learning in there. So they do differentiate, you know, the questions, it's been a couple of years probably since I looked at the precise questions, but they ask, did you read a book in the last week? In terms of internet use, the types of places you go. During COVID or after COVID, there were similar surveys done in several EU member countries that actually triangulated the low level of lifelong learning, which is a huge surprise to me when I just am passionate about learning.
Thank you.
I don't know, Juliana, if you've Juliane, if you've got anything to add to that.
Well, when you're talking now, and I was thinking about the concept of learning to learn, which would be a core skill to have if you were to do self-directed lifelong learning, online learning, whatever it is. That is something that I think we need to continue to focus on. Now, in some countries, in some educational system, that comes more naturally. Some have more opportunities to spend more time on that, but the ability to kind of self-learn, learning to learn, is important. If you think of an easy example is look at software development, right? So a software developer will never be finished completely. Maybe I'm using harsh terms, but basically you can learn something in school, but the technology is going to change. So you're expected to keep updated and learn the new languages, learn the new things that are coming up. And that is lifelong learning, whether it happens in a formal setting or if that happens by their own doing. yeah, about the learning to learn. So we just to say that that works quite differently around the world, and it is in many senses a soft skill. So it's a not so tangible thing, but I've seen instances in my work previously in sub-Saharan Africa where a lot of the educational system now, if you look at the K-12, like from primary school or kindergarten all the way up to the end of high school, even in university, a lot of these soft skills, including learning to learn, isn't necessarily part of what you get, right? And so you are in many ways at a disadvantage if you were to do self-directed lifelong learning or self-directed online learning or whatever it is. On the topic of K-12, I just wanted to highlight one example because I think you're right. A lot of the conversations that we're having, at least the ones that I get to be part of on open education, happens at the higher level. So we're talking specifically higher ed, also vocational training and such. In Norway, we have an example of the complete high school sector in Norway being covered by something called Norwegian Digital Learning Arena. It's an OER repository. They produce content, courses, everything like that. It is a national, I'd say national, but it's owned, it's an initiative owned by the municipalities around Norway, where all the content they produce for high school, which is digital learning, is open. But it takes quite a bit, I think, to get such an initiative underway. One thing also that I think plays into this is national curricula is different from what you can decide is a curricula in a vocational school or in a university. You have a little bit more flexibility and freedom than maybe you have at a lower level. Yeah, but I do recommend people to then take a look at NDLA and the work they're doing with regards to open access, open educational resources for the entire high school sector in Norway.
I guess my opening comment on the schooling sector, having been a primary elementary teacher right at the start of my career, but I haven't been in a school for quite a long time, so I need to put that on the public record. So what I have to say could well be a very much challenge for those who have much more working knowledge or key face knowledge, shall we say. First is the curriculum is never neutral. And so we should be very careful about generalizing our observations from one culture or context to another. In some EU member states, as an example, schools do not have the freedom to choose their own textbooks. Those are determined at a national level. That's not something I'm used to from a Southern Hemisphere, Australia, New Zealand perspective. Teachers have a lot more autonomy. Having said that, there is a big difference between being an elementary teacher and a teacher at the second or secondary level, where the stakes are higher. Assessment tends to drive the curriculum a lot more, recognizing, again, I'm making generalizations. I have been involved with a very interesting Irish company that ultimately sold itself, went off to the US, called Fish Tree. And what they did is they developed OER to map to state curricula and learning outcomes. And so there's an example of actually the kind of closed and open worlds coexisting. But one of my probably main observations here is I think we shouldn't treat OER, and I'm talking about the resource in this context, as apple pie, as somehow not open to question, because, you know, quality comes into this conversation. And there are reasons why actually some of those resources cost quite a lot, because they do go through a quality process. And that's not the case for a lot of OER. Of course, the crowd hopefully is wise and helps filter through the quality. That's part of what openness is about, and the transparency. But one last comment that I very rarely hear in the OER discussion. As a teacher, a beginning teacher starting out, the creation of my own resources was actually a cognitive process that contributed greatly to my thinking and my philosophy as an educator. Yes, okay, OER stands on the shoulders of those that came before us, but the process of developing resources is actually a really important educative process. So short-circuiting that might not always be to the best interests of teachers with the kind of mindsets and philosophies we might wish.
So, Chris Young, you want to jump in with anything before I ask another question?
No, Kurt, it's your turn. Go for
Okay,
it.
sure. So I'm going to do a who, what, when, where, and why question. And I've just posted in YouTube, and I posted in our chat window information about the Open Ed conference that's November 7th to 9th that was created perhaps about 20 years ago by David Wiley, who was a guest on this show a couple of years ago. And I was at the last one, like Mark said, you know, back in the fall of 2019, I was in the UK. That's where Karina Basu and I met her there for the 50th anniversary of the Open U of the UK and the 20th or 30th anniversary of the Commonwealth of Learning at the time. So everything was happening in the fall of 2019. The last Open Ed Live conference was in Phoenix or Scottsdale at that time. It was a brilliant conference. So I just want to say that, you know, for $25 for students, $75 for anyone else, or, you know, it's worth thinking about going, and just check out the Open Ed conference. But now I'd like for Mark or Juliane to talk about who are their stars or heroes in the field of open education that people should be wanting to read about, or you mentioned in the panel, Mark, Martin Weller's Battle for Open book. You might want to talk a bit about that book. You've also mentioned your top 10 open education reads. You might want to tell people how they can locate those annual reports of top education reads. And Juliane, you might want to talk a bit about Encore. I don't think we've really ever gotten a description of Encore and maybe some of the best practices there, what some new initiatives or policies or programmatic efforts, as well as conferences that you might be, you know, or summits or institutes, or, you know, so you want to just in general, because we have some graduate students who might be watching this or listening to us down the road. Some professors assign these for their classes to watch. In fact, I do. And so the young people might want to find out a little bit who, what, when, where, and why things. So who would like to oh, we've already gotten the chat window, the 29th ICD conference. It will be in Costa Rica on 2020, and overlaps with Open Ed, November 6th to 9th. That's right, I read about that too. And Mark, when you were talking about the one in Ireland that you ran, I was tempted to come to that. Actually, I had overlapped with something I had going too. So there's a lot happening in this field. So Juliane, you want to Bill's in. Mark, you want to talk a little bit about who, what, when, where, and why?
Juliane, why don't you start off with Encore, since you've got that sitting on your background. It's an important European project.
Yeah, so I briefly opened earlier saying that it started, we're a consortium of 9 partners. It's a project that's been in the works for actually many, many years. Came into fruition after UNESCO signed into effect the OER recommendation in 2019. So what it is, it's a community. It is a network of stakeholders. We've focused our work. There's a lot of pieces, obviously, to a network and a project of this size, but really we've started looking at OER in Europe and saying that there is a lot of defragmentation. We know there's a lot of initiatives happening. There's a lot of activities, a lot of different individuals that are engaged in this, but we would like to create a space where this comes together, where people can learn from each other, add to each other, and kind of work in the same direction and as a community. So that's what Encore is. It is a network, a community of stakeholders for OER in Europe. Now, we say Europe, but it is also, it encompasses individuals, obviously, from the entire world. The idea is when we get together, we can solve challenges, right? We've focused our work up until now along 4 themes. So it's been interesting to have the network focus on different aspects of open education in Europe or open educational resources. So one of the aspects that we looked at is OER technology. So we've looked at the technology, the actual bits of OER repositories, the digital infrastructures that need to be in place. We've an AI partner involved, a Knowledge for All Foundation. We have LMS Canvas involved. We have digital content provision involved through H5P. So it's interactive content. And where we're looking at these things. Mark and his colleagues have been very heavily involved in the work that we do on policy, looking at what is it that we can learn about current status of what types of policies exist, whether it's national or institutional policies, but really what enables and what drives the uptake and implementation of OER in Europe. Again, a lot is still going to be transferable also to other regions. One bit of that feeds into another theme, but that's the business model aspect that Mark also mentioned earlier. So Encore actually looking at trying to bridge now the gap between, or at least get the academic sector and the business sector a bit closer together when it comes to the work on OER. And what is it? What is the scope and options for a private company to engage with open education OERs? And that is incredibly interesting. It's certainly something that I think is for many perceived as one of the biggest challenges. That ties into work on innovation, right? So we've had research completed. We've had a ton of events looking at what happens and what is the innovative bit that happens in education when we start doing OER, whether OER can be the innovator or the other way around. I'll put some links also to some resources below. And the last bit is quality. Mark, again, briefly mentioned the idea of quality of resources. A lot of people will question, how do you know whether or not a resource is good if it's just an open resource? The assumption could be made that if you just go to Google and find a resource, how do you know whether or not it's a good one? First of all, let's debunk kind of that myth that that's not necessarily the way that people find an OER. Very often they are organized, libraries of universities involved and such. And we've developed a quality transparency framework, really looking at how do we talk about quality. So if you have a repository, whether it's in university or otherwise, what is the kind of language and the way you present and communicate what the consumer, let's say, should expect and understand about how you have assessed quality. That is different, right? So before we could look at a publisher and they will provide the books and they will provide, and then you have a certain expectation of what that means. That is changing when it becomes more digital, more open, and more in terms of quantity. Now, we are moving towards a bit of larger issues. So we are looking at seeing how OER fits within a couple of cross-cutting issues. Already on the 7th, we are discussing the whether or not OER as a catalyst for business university cooperation overall, right? So what role can OER play in ensuring that business and universities cooperate better? We're looking at the same now, how can OER be a catalyst for innovating higher education in general? And then also for business innovation and employment. So just a segue there, I think we can use this also as a reminder to the earlier conversation. OER is just one piece of a larger conversation, or it could be the conversation that also has smaller pieces. We're talking about lifelong learning, but we're talking about transforming education, right? We're talking about attacking the current way of learning from different aspects, from all different sides. It's quite exciting. I'm going to put a couple of links that has the events. We have a couple of events coming up. They're all open for everyone to attend. As I said, it's a network. We want everyone to engage. At the end of this process in June, where we have a couple of events, we are now going to be writing white papers. So we want to look at what is the EU level policies that we could give some recommendations to. Is there anything that we could say to the EU level or to institutions and such?
Thank you,
And I'm sure I
Juliane.
forgot a ton, and Mark, feel free to add to it.
What you kind of cued me to is, since you were promoting a few conferences, let me do a little self-promotion. We're hosting the Eden Digital Learning Europe conference here in Dublin next month. And Eden is in its, I think, 32nd or it might be 33rd year. It's really the major European professional association. But the reason I'm doing a little self-promotion of that conference as co-chair is the conference theme is Yes, We Can. Now, most of you would think that's borrowed from Obama or Will I Am, but actually it's 50 years ago to this year when the Pointer Sisters launched their song, which really coined the phrase, Yes, We Can. And the reason that's important is, and the phrase, or the what's more than a phrase now, it's become a whole movement, is when we're talking about OERs, our open educational philosophies, our influences, which is, you asked who we were influenced by, I tend to look at, in my academic career, the sort of the light comes through the gaps. So where are the gaps? Rather than me pointing out the giants who have informed me, I'm always looking for where those gaps are. And you know what? We have a big challenge, and this is this tension between closed worlds, open worlds, fragmentation. Actually, your podcast series has a great role to play in building connections, joining the dots. If we look at the dominance of males, dominance of English-speaking countries, Chris asked the question about massification. Actually, that's really relevant in Africa, where the average age is almost, well, mind-bogglingly young compared to what we talk about with an aging population. So these are gaps. A great publication came out a year ago around looking at the journals that we don't read, open access journals in non-English speaking countries. So we have a big job to play in joining all of this up. When I'm looking for new knowledge, I'm not traditionally, or not really looking to read the traditional journals now for something that's going to say, wow, that's amazing. I'm searching for where the fresh ideas are coming from. That's part of openness, joining those up and influencing. So I've probably got a bit of a rant there, not fully answered your question, but yes, people like Rory McGreal and Martin Weller and so on are all giants, and you mentioned one of our field, but let's build the next generation and let's make it more inclusive and geographically diverse.
So we're running, we have 2 minutes left, and I want to make sure if you have any final comments, maybe about the future, maybe the impact of AI on it, or if Chris has a final comment or question that he wants to throw in here. Chris?
I would just say that we need to think carefully about motivation as well as learning. That self-directed learning requires a lot of things associated with it in terms of motivation. You have to have a growth mindset. You have to have self-efficacy about at least some of what you're learning. You have to have dispositions that involve things like innovation and tenacity and resilience. And I think that we need to balance the cognitive focus, which is certainly appropriate, with thinking about the social emotional skills that are also part of self-directed learning.
I just want to add what Mark said is significant. The different languages, different cultures. I think a lot of times when we, at least on this show, we talk about English, but there's so many other countries, especially developing countries, using with very little to access, with not even formal schools. So I think that's a significant piece, that because OER materials can be easily accessible in English, but not at all in all other languages. So that's another part. I think I really want to highlight what Mark said is the political environment. Some countries simply don't allow you to access their open, education resources. So thank you to Julian and Mark for being here. This is a wonderful show. So who is introducing the next episode?
I got the next episode. So do you want to make a final 15, 20-second comment, Juliane or Mark, before I introduce the next show?
I'd be happy to just, I think the end of it can bring us back to equality and the kind of opportunity that we have with open education, and now we're seeing with open science, or the open education movement overall. The opportunity now that we have to create, make sure that people have equal access, whether or not it's the same type of education. We can have localized content, we could have translation of content, or much more content being produced where the knowledge lays, right, where it comes from, and it can be suitable for so many more people. We can bring down the costs, we can reduce those inequalities of privilege, and you know, what we some of the examples that Mark made. So I think simple things makes a huge difference. I've seen open software being used as an argument, saying if you use non-open software, some of these students will not afford to use it when they have to apply it after school. And I think we can remember that as kind of an argument for open knowledge equity access.
Thank you, Juliane. Mark, any final comment?
Well, one very last slogan that I kind of borrow. I think we just have to keep in mind that OER is not the big idea. It's in the service of the big idea. What are the big ideas? The Sustainable Development Goals, our planet, the future of humanity is at risk. To be honest, I'm less concerned about upskilling for work. I'd rather have conversations about the redistribution of wealth and the redefinition of work itself. I'll stop on that note.
So next week builds on this week, actually, because I got this report from Fiona Hollins, and I love her reports. It's this one here. It's called The Benefits and Costs of Participation in MOOC-Based Alternative Credentials. And Fiona was at the Teachers College Columbia, and she's branched off into her own consulting company called Ed Researcher. And next week, I have 3 of her colleagues and her who did this report talk about micro-credentials and specializations for the masses, of alternative credentials for the non-traditional age. And next week is episode 153. This week was 152. I misspoke at the start of this one. And so I welcome you all coming in next week. Thanks for your